Annie Finelli is a middle-aged woman who appears to have a perfect life. She's getting married in 6 weeks to a wealthy and handsome man named Luke. Annie defines herself as a wind-up doll who does not want people to feel bad because of her. One afternoon, while shopping for wedding knives, something triggers from within, and she imagines a blade coated in blood while Luke is lying down on the floor. And immediately, Annie snaps out of her daydream and rejects the blade, claiming it is too heavy. After that, the couple decides to grab some of their favorite pizza and head toward a cafe. While Luke goes to the restroom, Annie sneakily gobbles down the last slices of pizza, but later she tells Luke that the waitress spilled drinks over the pizza and her dress to justify the absence of his share of lunch. The next morning, Annie and her friend Nell board the subway, and Annie is noticeably nervous. She has visions of someone bursting through a window and shooting a gun through it. We then discover that Annie works at an influential women's magazine where she writes about topics she isn't particularly proud of, such as how to please men and how to fulfill their desires. Despite this, her editor at the magazine is really supportive of her and thinks there's a chance she'll land a pretty wonderful job working for the New York Times. Later, Annie has a meeting with a man named Aaron. He is an independent filmmaker who has been working on a documentary about the 1999 private school shootout. He wants to know whether Annie was a hero or accomplice during that shootout. Aaron informs her that her old classmate Dean Barton had accused Annie of being involved in the gunfire and had consented to be interviewed for the documentary. Dean Barton is currently a politician who has worked actively on gun legislation reform and has recently written a book. Therefore, Aaron encourages Annie to tell the truth because she has never disclosed what happened to her on that day. But on the other hand, Annie excuses herself and declares that she has no interest in Dean or the documentary. Now, Aaron is upset with the reaction, but his desire to learn more about the incident sends Annie into a panic. The film then shifts to 1999, when a young Annie is about to start her first day at Brentley Private School. She has recently received a scholarship to attend this elite institution. During lunch, we meet Dean's younger self and his friends, Liam, Peyton, and Olivia, who are the popular and wealthy kids in their school. They start making fun of Annie, so another guy named Arthur takes her to a different table to avoid toxicity. Back in the present, Annie sees Dean on the morning news show talking about how his spinal cord was shot, causing permanent paralysis, and how he supports gun control. When Luke arrives at the scene, he tells Annie that she should not feel compelled to do the documentary. He informs Annie that he has received a job opportunity in London and suggests that she participate in the MFA program there. Annie, on the other hand, refuses to go because she feels she might lose her chance to work at the New York Times. In the past, Annie and her friends go to a school party where Arthur gets in trouble for bringing booze. Following the dance, Annie and the other girls leave to go on a joyride with a group of boys. Just then, a teacher at the school named Andrew Larson tries to stop the girls, but he eventually lets them go after a brief chat. Meanwhile, Annie is currently trying on wedding gowns when she and her mother get into an argument. Moments later, she gets a call from Aaron, which surprises Nell because she assumed Annie was not interested in the interview. She asks Annie whether she's prepared to reveal Dean's true nature, but Annie replies that she needs to get married and land a position at the New York Times first, because at this point, nobody will believe her. Later, as Annie browses her Facebook feed, she notices that a woman has called her a psycho slut. It turns out that the woman is a relative of a school shooting victim named Liam Ross. Later that night, Annie runs into her former English teacher, Andrew Larson. As they chat, Annie discovers that Mr. Larson is also working on the documentary with Aaron. When he asks if she'll do the interview, Annie lies and says that she and Luke are relocating to London. And later, when the couple is driving home, Luke becomes enraged at Annie for lying about London after she previously refused him. She then informs Luke that she wants to work for the New York Times and shares her side of the school shooting story. But Annie is hesitant to do it now because Dean is a big deal in the nation right now, and she's just a sex columnist for some newspaper. We then witness another flashback of Annie passing out at Dean's house. From the looks of it, her drink must have been spiked by someone. She suddenly comes to her senses and realizes a guy named Peyton is going down on her. Annie is on the bathroom floor, powerless to stop what's happening to her body. She tries to leave once Peyton is finished, but she is again stopped in the hallway by the boys. Even though Annie is bleeding, her boyfriend Liam chooses to force himself on her. After he leaves, she once again gets back up and leaves the bathroom. She enters Dean's bedroom and tries to put on clothes, and when she notices Dean entered the room, she makes an excuse to leave. But Dean has some other plans with her and holds Annie down. eventually raping her. A few moments later, she punches him with all her strength and somehow manages to escape. Distraught and scared, Annie goes to the nearest store to find a means to get back home. There, she meets her teacher, Mr. Larson, and he takes her home. Larson comforts her and requests that she inform her mother about the situation, but Annie refuses to do so because she knows that the incident will only make her mother angry. In the present, Annie meets with Aaron again, and this time, he tells her that Dean is ready to defend her and apologize for accusing her of involvement in the school shooting. But Annie states that she doesn't want to meet him and instead wants to talk about the gang rape. After that, Aaron thanks her for agreeing to be in the documentary and promises to keep her away from him. Later, Luke and Annie go to have a meal with their parents. She then tells Nell that she's scared she'll feel sorry for Dean after seeing him in his wheelchair. During lunch, Annie becomes irritated with everyone and walks away. She is followed by her mom, who is meant to console her, but ends up informing Annie that the documentary could harm her own reputation. She blames Annie for what happened to her because she did not follow the rules like she was supposed to. She then pleads with Annie not to do anything that may jeopardize her relationship with Luke and his family. That night, Annie apologizes to Luke for her earlier behavior, and the two start kissing. As the situation escalates, Annie kisses him aggressively and ends up injuring his lips. She suddenly tells Luke to get off her, and Luke claims that Annie can't handle it when he tries to be respectful. The scene then shifts to young Annie, who goes to get Plan B with Liam. She even apologizes to him for hooking up with someone else, and Liam says it's fine. Annie eventually reveals that she was raped, but Liam dismisses her as insane and says she has no idea what rape is. Annie apologizes once more, and soon, the rest of the boys who assaulted her arrive and praise her performance from the night before. Later, Mr. Larson informs the headmaster about the whole incident, and he tells Annie of the consequences of reporting the event. With the amount of alcohol involved, the headmaster warns her that she must be certain of what happened. Mr. Larson affirms that there is no misunderstanding because Annie clearly said no. With this meaningless back and forth, Annie starts to crumble and begins to doubt her own truth. And to deal with this situation properly, the headmaster tries calling Annie's parents, but Annie urges them to stop and claims that she has changed her mind about reporting it. After school, Annie rushes to Arthur's house and informs him that Mr. Larson has been fired for allowing the girls to leave the school dance. But Arthur informs her that this is not the first time Peyton, Liam, and Dean have ganged up on someone. He reveals that Dean and Liam once assaulted their mutual friend, Ben, in the woods and defecated on his chest. Arthur is upset with Ben for dropping the accusations, and he isn't happy that Annie is doing the same. The next day at school, Dean tries to irritate Arthur, and the two get into a fight. Seeing this, a teacher attempts to break up the fight, but Arthur mistakenly punches her, and moments later, Arthur is suspended for assaulting the teacher. However, he is more outraged that Annie apologized to Liam after they raped her. He then makes Annie feel worthless for not having the courage to speak up for the truth. The two then argue, and Annie calls him a loser and walks away. Now, we fast forward to the present. Annie decides to tell her side of the tale, but only if she doesn't have to run into Dean. She remembers glancing at Dean's neck before a big explosion happened in front of them. Students are hurled about the room, and after the blast, Annie lies on the floor when a friend helps her up. They go upstairs to hide in a room, which they attempt to barricade. Meanwhile, Arthur and Ben soon start killing the students. Then Ben approaches Peyton and asks if he wants to walk to the woods. Realizing he is about to get shot as well, Peyton immediately begs for mercy, but he is shot right away. And before leaving the room, Ben nods to Annie as if they have a mutual understanding. After this, all the students rush to Peyton's help. Annie, on the other hand, pulls a knife and tells them they need to get out of there. They proceed downstairs, and Liam tries to catch up with them, but Annie decides not to hold the door open for him. A few moments later, he is also shot by Ben. During the gunfire, Olivia and Annie try to flee downstairs, where they meet Dean. It is at this point that Arthur approaches Annie and asks Olivia to leave. He then hands the revolver to Annie and instructs her to kill Dean, but she is unable to do so. But Arthur gets agitated by her response and takes the revolver from her grasp and shoots Dean in the leg. Then we see that Annie, armed with a knife, stabbed Arthur in the neck, causing him to bleed out and die. Adult Annie confesses that Arthur's expression was confused, and she is still unable to hold a knife without seeing his face. At Liam's funeral, Annie realizes Dean has been telling everyone that she was a shooter's accomplice. He claims Annie slept with Dean and Liam and went on a vengeance spree after Dean refused to date her. Annie's mother then informs her that she is disgusted with her and that she is not the daughter she raised. On the other hand, Aaron is perplexed as to why Annie never pressed charges against the boys. Then he tells Annie that at least she is fortunate to have a mother who believes in her. Meanwhile, the interview is interrupted when Dean shows up in the room. He then requests 5 minutes with Annie, but she walks off in a rage. At home, she informs Luke that she will not be participating in the documentary and will instead write something to explain her side of the story. She also decides to accompany him to London and write a book there, which makes Luke happy. The next day, Annie informs her boss that she is considering moving to London. She gives her story to her boss and wants the New York Times to print it. Her boss then discloses a non-consensual behavior that happened to her, then informs Annie that her half-assed narrative would not be accepted, since Annie is too remorseful about the boys who took advantage of her. Annie is too polite to the people who let her down and encourages her to write again with more honesty. Later, during a book signing, Dean discusses what occurred to him. While Annie looks through the bookshelves, the people there seem to be inspired by him. Afterward, the two have a private conversation. Dean doesn't want Annie to tell Aaron everything because he has a wife and daughters now. He begins to make excuses, claiming that he was drunk when he took advantage of her. He then threatens Annie not to mention what happened that night, or he'll lie even more. Dean begins to cry and drops his handkerchief, so Annie decides to help him. But moments later, his ego couldn't handle it and eventually admits to raping her. It turns out that Annie had recorded their entire conversation without him knowing. Now, this finally provides her with a solid foundation to build her story without being directly blamed for it. On the day of the wedding rehearsal dinner, Annie is informed that her piece would be published in the New York Times. She is very ecstatic after hearing the news and immediately calls Luke to show him the news. However, Luke gets enraged and is disgusted by the details of the incident. Dismissing his wife's horrific past, he is more concerned about how his family would respond after reading it. Luke believes she should have dealt with her situation quietly. He claims that the rapists have already paid for their mistake because Dean is in a wheelchair and the others are already dead. Therefore, he can't understand why Annie would tell this story right before their wedding. Luke goes on to claim that this is not the Annie he knew. She is no longer upbeat and cheerful. Just at that moment, Annie realizes that she never showed him her true self because she knew he wouldn't fall in love with her. Annie pretended to be the woman he craved since she had always wanted to be with a wealthy man like Luke. After knowing that it was all a pretense, she then breaks off their engagement. Meanwhile, Annie's article goes viral and she receives messages from women all over the world thanking her for sharing her story and revealing that they too have been sexually abused. In the final scene, we see Annie working for the New York Times, fulfilling the dream she had always kept alive in the depths of her heart. On the Today Show, she is interviewed about her story while her mother anxiously watches. Later, while Annie is on her way home, she is stopped by a woman who berates her for defaming Dean, and she even accuses her of taking a shortcut to get media attention. Annie is temporarily stunned at first, but she quickly calls the woman back and curses her before walking away like a boss.